Ladies and gentlemen,
Good evening.
are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here, and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, today we have on the show Chris Rolls to bring us our second part of our two-part series. Now, if you didn't catch our first part of this two-part series, please head back to part one as we talk to Chris about his experience as a serial investor, having built and sold 4 businesses, 3 of which were amongst the largest of their kind in Australia. But now here we are with part 2 of our two-part series, where we turn the tables and talk to Chris about his position as a buyer. He founded PieLAB Venture Partners in 2016, which is a venture capital fund that invests in early stage technology businesses focused on the real estate sector. And in this episode, we talk all about his experience as a buyer, what he's looking for in businesses on the market, and how it is that sellers can position their businesses to be attractive to buyers. So if you are looking to sell your business at any point in the future, or indeed you're involved in business sales or acquisitions in any way, shape or form, this episode is for you. So without further ado, here we go with our discussion with Chris. Chris, a huge thank you for coming back to us on the Deal Room Podcast.
No problems, Joe. Good to be back.
Oh, it's fabulous to have you back. Now, part 1, for anyone who missed it, it's very interesting background to where we're going in part 2, talking about your background in buying and selling. Well, not buying businesses, selling businesses at that point. Now we're flipping the viewpoint here and looking at what you know as a buyer, and those useful bits of information for any of our listeners out there who are looking at a sale into the future. So, Chris, anyone who heard the story before will know a bit about your background, but very quickly, in a nutshell, maybe we just start, if you can give us a quick overview of PieLAB, and then we'll get into your perspective as a buyer.
Yeah, sure. So what PieLAB is we're a firm that invests in private businesses. So we take varying stakes all the way through to 100% of them. So we're a bit like a private equity firm, although not like a more traditional private equity firm that buys businesses, grows them rapidly over a period of sort of 3 or 4 years and then sells them again. We have sort of a much longer time horizon for that. And in an ideal scenario, we buy good businesses and hold on to them forever. And help those businesses grow. So that's what we do. We typically buy businesses that are generating sort of between $1 and $3 million of EBITDA. So they're not huge businesses, but they're also not sort of micro businesses as well. And we typically invest in sort of check sizes of sort of $5 to $15 million is sort of our sweet spot. And, like all private sort of equity groups, they all have different nuances, and sort of some of the nuances that we're after particularly are buying asset light businesses. So businesses that don't have lots and lots of, heavy machinery and plant and equipment. And we like businesses with subscription or recurring revenue. And they're the sorts of businesses that we like to acquire.
Brilliant. Okay, wonderful. And so we talked a lot in part 1 about the ideas or the learnings that you had as a seller. Of course, now you've had a lot more experience in the market since you sold your previous businesses, looking at businesses through the eyes of a buyer. And one of the things you said in our last episode, which I absolutely resonated with, is the importance for sellers in understanding what a buyer's looking for in their business, what creates value and risk in the eyes of a buyer, and essentially looking at their business with the goggles on as though they were a buyer. Of course, it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to actually give them that lens. And so that's what I'm hoping to do today in our discussion. So why don't we start with what it is. So you've talked about the sorts of businesses that you look to acquire, but what to you are the standouts that make a business valuable for you as acquirer versus those businesses where you can see perhaps the sellers haven't understood the value in a buyer's eyes?
Yeah, sure. So there's a number of different things that we look for when we're buying a business. And as we mentioned very briefly in the previous sort of episode, we're really trying to identify risk. As I said, when you go to buy a business, you don't know all of the risks, and there are a whole bunch because you just don't have the knowledge that the seller has. So the sorts of things that we typically look for are histories of stable revenue. So where you've got a business that over the last 5 years, the revenue has fluctuated from, $3 million 1 year to $5 million the next, to $4 million the year after, to $7 million the year after that, to $2 million the year after that, where you've got that very big volatility of revenue. Those sorts of businesses are very difficult to sell and generally don't attract, good multiples. And that's simply because of the volatility. Volatility is risk. Any business has a set of fixed overheads, and if this year the revenue is $7 million, but the risk is that next year it's going to be $4, then that represents a big risk for the buyer of the business. So that's one of the first things, stability of revenue. And then, of course, revenue is one thing, but profits are another. So just because you've got stable revenue doesn't mean you have stable profits. So looking at sort of the bottom line and sort of say, well, a history of stable profits is also an important thing. They don't, one of the really interesting things about businesses is that a lot of people have this perception that in order to get a good price for your business, it has to show, rapid growth. And that's not the case. There's different buyers for different types of businesses. So when we look at a business, rapid growth is not something that is the be all and end all for us. It's always nice if a business is growing, and we don't like businesses that are shrinking. But sometimes you see people when they're getting their business ready for sale, they're investing lots in sales and marketing to try and show large, amounts of growth. Now the problem with that is while that might make revenue grow, it often adds a layer of cost that results in revenue growing and profits not growing, or potentially profits shrinking, which strangely can actually detract from the value. So seeing good linear growth in both revenue and profit is much more important than seeing off the charts revenue growth and declining profits. So that's sort of another thing that we look at. The third thing I think that is really important is understanding that when you are the owner of the business who's operating the business and you're selling it, one of the big questions in the eyes of the buyer is who's going to operate it, when they own it. And so ensuring that you've got a solution for that. Now that may be an internal employee that you are grooming to take over the business. It could be a really disciplined set of process and procedures in place that allow for someone to come in and run that much more easily than if they weren't there. So there's a few ways of mitigating that. Just because you have been running it doesn't mean you can't demonstrate that this is a business that can run well without you. Of course, the best way of demonstrating that is actually having a business that runs without you. And interestingly, the last business that I sold, I did exactly that. I stepped out as the CEO 2 years before we sold it. It was under management. It continued to grow, and it had a good history of sort of stable revenue and stable profits, which made it an attractive asset for someone to buy. And they're the sorts of things that I think are important. So when you sort of look at those, stable revenue, stable profits, ideally growing, a solution for who's going to run the business, and then you sort of get into a whole myriad of other, risk items, things like, all of the contractual issues internally in the business, contracts with suppliers, contracts with employees, potential legal issues in the business. You've got the elements of financial due diligence. How much are we spending on sales and marketing? Are we getting returns for that? All of that sort of operational and financial due diligence that an astute buyer will do when buying your business. But those first three, I think, are probably the big deal breakers in most cases when people look at a business.
Brilliant. And one of the things that we had talked about in the past was the opportunity that you see for sellers in staying around with the business. Of course, this is one of it can be one of the tricky things. I find that when sellers get get an idea of sale in their mind, that's it. They want to get sold. They want to get out straight away. And of course, that absolutely can impact, number one, the pool of buyers, and number two, the value that they may have. And I guess part of the issue is getting sellers to think about sale well in advance, so that they're happy to sell at a point where they are happy to still be engaged with the business for a while. Perhaps you could give us a little, give us some insight into the business owners that you've worked with and the reasons that they've been happy to stay around, the positives for you as a buyer, and how it is that sellers recognise when that might be the optimal point for them to start thinking about sale, realising it might very well be a lot earlier than they'd otherwise realised.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that I see a lot, particularly with older business owners, so people that are potentially contemplating retirement, people that have been running their business for a long time, they often have this perspective that, for example, if they're going to retire, then their only option is to sell 100% of the business. And very often people get poor advice from accountants along those lines, which is, they go to their accountant and say, look, I'm ready to retire. What do I do? And the accountant says, well, you need to sell your business. Now there are pros and cons of selling 100% of the business versus not selling 100% of the business. And most people don't really understand the nuances between the two. And one of the things that we actually do when we're talking to business owners is really understanding what is it that they want. And one of the interesting things you find is that, most people, particularly when they're at retirement age, when they've spent a lifetime building a business, haven't really thought about what happens the day that they sell it. What are they going to do each day? And often they feel lost. There's this element of kind of, well, I've been going to work, for the last 20 years, and I sold my business. It settled yesterday. I have nothing to do today. And sometimes it takes them a little while to get to the point where they actually feel almost like a sense of loss. And sometimes it happens straight away. And one of the things that is a way of avoiding that is to stay involved in the business. Now, there's a few benefits of doing that. The first is that if you're a seller of a business and you're willing to retain, say, 30% of it, that says a lot to the incoming buyer in terms of your trust in this business's ability to continue to generate profits. It's a big risk mitigator in the eyes of a buyer. Now, having said that, it also adds some complexities as well. One of the things you'll need to do is you'll need to have a shareholders agreement in place. You'll need to have an understanding as to, if you are retaining 30% of the business, what happens if you decide you don't get on with a new buyer and you want to be able to sell your 30%. So there's lots of aspects of that, but they can all be dealt with in really sort of reasonable ways that protect the interests of both parties. So one of the things that we do when we look at a business is we have a really frank conversation with the owner about what do they really want. Because sometimes we see a business, and I'll give you an example of one. We bought a business a couple of years ago. It was a business where in the IT sector, husband and wife were running the business, and they originally had the business on the market to sell the whole thing, and they actually had it under contract, and it subsequently fell over. And when we got talking to them, it became clear that the husband quite liked running the business, probably wanted to continue it. His wife was more conservative, wanted to potentially take some of the risk off the table. And we said to them, well, how would you feel in a scenario where we bought 70% of the business, you retain 30% of the business, you stay on as the CEO, and we move forward, in what was an unexpected way for them. And they agreed on that, and we still work with them. They're our partners. They still own 30% of the business. The business is doing well, and it's been a great partnership. And you look at that and sort of say, it's a very different outcome. It was actually what they wanted, but no one had thought to mention that. Now, a big part of that is being able to trust the buyer that goes in, because obviously if you're selling down 70%, you need to be able to trust the party on the other side. And that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing, is explaining how we operate, being very, very clear about the way that we like to operate a business. So in our business, we like to operate businesses for maximum profit generation so they can pay dividends. We're not necessarily after, a scenario where we grow a business by 50 or 100% a year. And the reason behind that is that reduces risk. If we're not sort of really pushing the boundaries on growth, it also generates free cash flow for the seller, which is a really appealing scenario. So in a scenario where you keep 30% of the business, one of the interesting things is that you end up with a much better cash flow, position post-exit. And a lot of people don't sort of think about it. If you go and sell a business, and let's say you sold a business for whatever, $5 million, by the time you go and pay off some debt, maybe buy a holiday house, maybe pay off the mortgage, you obviously have to pay tax on the proceeds. What you're left with is a much smaller proportion to then go and invest to fund potentially a retirement, or if that's what you're wanting to do. And most people, when they then go to their financial planner, they're encouraged to invest in a portfolio of sort of shares or some residential property, and their cash yield is sort of 3 to 5%. So all of a sudden they sold the business for 5, their proceeds were maybe only 3 by the time they paid all those expenses. They go and invest that, and they get 5% a year. That's $150,000 a year when they could have been used to living off $300,000 or $400,000 a year. Whereas if they keep that 30% in there, first of all, they're not paying tax on that 30%. And in almost all cases, when we partner with someone in that scenario, we're able to increase the amount of dividends that are flowing out of that business. So while they may only keep 30%, they end up sort of getting cash flow that might be as close to sort of 50% of what they were getting previously. And the other thing, of course, is they get to stay involved. They don't always stay on as the CEO. Sometimes they just join the board. But we like having them around because they've got an element of knowledge. It de-risks things for us, and it also enables the people that are working in the business to feel more comfortable that the person that they, was their CEO, was the owner of the business, isn't sort of abandoning them as well. So there's lots of advantages of that. You've just got to pick the right partner, and that's an important thing.
I love it. I think you're absolutely right. It is, though, absolutely about choosing the right partner, the right buyer there. But I have some fabulous memories of clients I've worked with over the years. One comes to mind readily. I worked with him in his sale. It was a great business. He built it up over 40 years, and he sold the business to a large listed buyer. And I'd call him, once a month or every couple of months after the sale, just to check in and see how he was. He was still in the office there, the office that they had been in, because the business moved out and into the business itself moved out of the premises. He's still there. He went back every day. I was like, what are you doing? He's still there. Why are you still there? Go and, go on holidays with your poor wife who's been waiting for you to get out of this business. But he was so connected to the business. It literally took him about 8 months to get out of that mindset. And he just would have loved an approach like the approach that you're talking about here, because it was his business baby. And
that's a sort of thing. Unless you're an entrepreneur and have built a business, you probably don't realize the level of attachment that entrepreneurs have with their business. It's their legacy, and and I think that's one of the reasons why private equity sometimes gets a bad name. Now we are a private equity investor, meaning that we invest. We acquire equity in private businesses, but we're not. We don't have a fund structure that requires us to buy a business, grow it rapidly, and sell it. We actually buy businesses and hold on to them for the long term, ideally forever, and never sell them. That's our preferred, scenario. And so one of the things we find is that we are quite a preferred buyer of a business, because we don't go to try and strip costs out in order to rapidly grow profits. We don't, dress the business up for a quick sale 3 or 4 years later. We don't merge it into another business, which means that people lose their jobs. The most important thing for us is really focusing on finding a good business with good long-term partners and continuing to run it largely as it has been run before, but introducing little tweaks in order to improve the performance over the long term. So because we don't have to sell it in 3 years, we don't have to do things really quickly. We can, work on the improvement over multiple years. And that's one of the things that's one of the reasons people like selling businesses to us.
Brilliant. Look, Chris, a huge thank you for coming on to the podcast today. I think you've given a lot of information that will be really useful for our sellers and for our buyers out there. How about you let us know how it is if any of our listeners would like to get in contact with you, find out a little bit more about PieLAB, or think they might have an opportunity for you perhaps to partner with. How do they find you?
Sure. I mean, the easiest way is to go to our website, PieLAB, PIELAB.com.au. And we're pretty easy to get in contact with from there. And if there are listeners out there that have a business, feel free to get in touch. Even if you don't think it's going to fit or it might not be big enough, we often stay in touch with people for multiple years before they're ready to sell the business. And that's actually a good thing because it allows them to build a relationship with us and learn how we operate. We bought a business last year that we were in touch with the owner for sort of 4 years, before we actually acquired it. And that's not an uncommon thing. We're not necessarily in any hurry. What we want is the right outcome for everyone so that everyone works together and gets a good outcome moving forward.
I've got so many ideas for other podcasts in the future where I want to drill into that a bit more. But Chris, for now, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to the Deal Room. It's been a real pleasure having you.
No worries, Joe. It's been fun having a conversation. Thank you.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Deal Room podcast. We hope you're now primed for your next deal with these pointers and have enjoyed these fascinating insights. Now, if you'd like more information about this topic, then head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com, where you'll be able to download a transcript of this episode, as well as access any contact details and any other additional information we referred to in today's podcast. Now, if you'd like to get in contact with our guests today and the services they offer, you can go ahead and check out our show notes for a link right through to them and their details. You can also book in directly with our legals at Aspect Legal if you'd like to soundboard your next steps, discuss a legal question, or find out more how we can assist, whether that's with buying or selling a business, or perhaps somewhere in between. Now, don't forget to subscribe to the Deal Room podcast on your favourite podcast player to get notifications whenever a new episode is out. We'd also love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review and rating if you're already one of our subscribers, or even if you're listening to this podcast for the very first time. Every review helps our team produce valuable content for you. Well, thanks again for listening in. You've been listening to Joanna Oakey and the Deal Room podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. Aspect Legal has a number of great services that help businesses prepare for a sale or acquisition, to help them prepare in advance and to get transaction ready. We've also got a range of services to help guide businesses through the sale and acquisitions process. We work with clients both big and small and have different types of services depending on size and complexity. We provide a free consultation to discuss your proposed sale or acquisition. So see our show notes on how to book a time to speak with us, or head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Room podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.